Okay, welcome everybody. Yes, so I'm Georgina Mace. I'm actually a professor at UCL, but I'm a science advisor to the ESPA programme. And for those of you that don't know, ESPA, which is on the slide there, is System Services for Poverty Alleviation, was a large research programme funded by NERC, ESRC and DFID since I think it started in 2010. And we're just in the last month or so of the programme at the moment. And one of the themes of ESPA right the way through has been about how rewards could and should be made for environmental stewardship. So in a world where we know there's environmental degradation taking place very seriously in many areas, but particularly in many areas where there are very poor people, and where there are also increasing financial resources for environmental protection or enhancement, there's a question about whether those new financial resources can benefit poor people, especially in areas of degraded environment. And it's an interesting and topical question because those funding sources, whether they're big public money coming from governments, for example through climate mitigation, climate adaptation funding, big international monetary transfers, whether they're local transfers around public goods and benefits for, say, water or hazard protection, flood resistance, or whether they are simple local arrangements between people who need different things from the landscape, or maybe payments from conservation organisations for environmental conservation and protection. We need to understand the way in which those can benefit poor people, and whether that is actually a way in which that filters down and benefits the poorest. So a number of ESPA projects have been investigating that, and we're going to hear from 4 of the project leaders this evening. They're each of them going to give you about a 7-minute talk presenting their results. And then we will have plenty of time after that for there to be a discussion. You can all raise questions and we'll get the panel of speakers to answer. And there are other people in the room who've been involved in related projects or in other parts of ESPA. So I hope in the second half of this meeting we'll be able to have a really productive discussion, and feel free to raise anything you want to. At the back of the room is our ESPA policy summary, which has just come out. And if you want to download it, if you go to this webpage, you will find it. There's a couple of hard copies lying around. And that's literally hot off the press within the last 24 hours or something. And then there are there's an ESPA governance policy brief as well, which you feel free to take when you leave. So I think with that we will kick off with the talk. This is Julia Jones from Bangor University, and she is going to talk about exactly what it says up there.
Great, thank you, Georgina. So obviously everyone in this room knows that tropical forests provide incredibly valuable global ecosystem services. And in recognition of that, funding schemes such as REDD+, reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation, have been introduced. Now you could see REDD+ as a mechanism for rewarding environmental stewardship, but it's doing it at the national scale, very, very large scale. Now, like all conservation projects, sort of intended to reduce tropical deforestation, of course it has the potential to influence the lives of the forest residents and people living at the forest frontier, many of whom are some of the poorest in the world. And it has the potential to influence their lives in a number of different ways. So first of all, there can be costs, opportunity costs, in terms of the restriction, the restrictions they feel in terms of their opportunities to expand agricultural land. But there can also be benefits. So as well as providing global ecosystem services, tropical forests provide local services in terms of preventing too much surface runoff, resulting in sedimentation of water, flood risk, preventing, if you have deforestation, you can end up with low levels of dry season recharge. So what happens in terms of the forest management does influence agricultural land and water quality. And there's also another mechanism by which policies like REDD+ can influence local people's lives, and that's through payments that are made to incentivise or to support livelihood change or shifts or adaptations, potentially through improved agricultural, so it might be subsidies for new agricultural techniques, or it might even be infrastructure such as irrigation dams that are designed to improve agriculture. So we've kind of conceptualised this in a really simple schematic model. So how does REDD+ influence the lives of the poor at the forest frontier? So obviously there's the cost through opportunity cost. There's this route mediated through locally important ecosystem services, and there's this other route in terms of potentially valuable micro-development projects carried out at the forest frontier to improve agriculture, for example. And we've been looking at all of these routes in terms of their influence on local people in a REDD+ pilot project called CAS, which is in eastern Madagascar. So first of all, let's talk about that first route in terms of opportunity cost. So this is the result of, I'm giving you 7 minutes, but this is 3.5 years, huge amounts of data collection, choice experiments, household surveys, agricultural mapping, inputs and outputs. And from that, what we can tell you is that the opportunity costs of conservation restrictions are very significant, and they're felt mostly by the poor. So there's more significant as a percentage of household income for the poorest households. So about 40 to 140% of median incomes. So the opportunity costs are large, they're very real, and they're felt especially by the poorest. So what about these benefits mediated through ecosystem services? Well, again, huge amounts of really intensive hydrological fieldwork and modelling to come up with this 30-second result. So forest cover absolutely does affect surface water runoff. We've been able to quantify this for eastern Madagascar, and through our modelling, led by Mark Mulligan at King's College London, we've been able to show that we've been able to look at the effect on the beneficiaries in terms of who benefits from these changes, these hydrological benefits. So what we've shown is there are real hydrological benefits of forest conservation, but they're actually quite small in terms of the magnitude of their effect. And the people benefiting aren't necessarily the same people who are bearing opportunity costs. So what about direct development projects, micro-development projects, for example? So again, we've done all sorts of work to try and look at this. We've particularly focused, the results I'm showing you here are of a specific type of micro-development project that was carried out around this REDD+ project that was explicitly framed as compensation under social safeguarding. So this scheme had international funding through the World Bank, and therefore there was an obligation to ensure social safeguards were met under the World Bank social safeguards. And what we've shown, I'm sorry about the graphs, I hoped to improve them in train but didn't have time. Essentially those big orange bars are showing you the number of households that were bearing significant opportunity costs under different assumptions. Whatever assumptions you use, it's more than about 5,500 households. The blue bar is showing you how many were identified to receive compensation from the scheme. It's less than about half. And then the final bar, the last bar, is the fact that 0 households received full compensation. That's based on detailed contingent valuation 2 years after they received the compensation. So what we've shown is these micro-development projects, they have not compensated for the cost of conservation. So they certainly haven't brought additional benefits. They haven't compensated for the cost. We've also published research a couple of years ago that shows that this blue bar is biased towards the richer, the more socially connected, politically powerful individuals. So it's not the most vulnerable and the most dependent on forest resources. So what can REDD+ contribute to poverty alleviation? There's certainly a role to play in forest conservation more broadly in terms of local benefits. There are potential benefits from it, but we certainly shouldn't make lazy assumptions about positive impact. Just because there are global benefits doesn't mean these are necessarily felt locally. But then coming to the title of this overall symposium, Rewarding Environmental Stewardships, what can that tell us for, what's the role in development policy? Well, the first point to make is REDD+ is very much a scheme designed to reward environmental stewardship nationally. So it's about payments to countries made if they can supply good environmental stewardship. But because it's that very large national scale, it almost inevitably will involve some degree of coercion, legal sanctions at the small scale, which isn't necessarily conducive to good poverty alleviation outcomes. So I think what's really interesting is we're now going to be hearing from schemes which are much more about voluntary, incentivising voluntary enrolment in schemes that try and improve environmental stewardship. So I think that could be really interesting to hear more about. So finally, I'm presenting this to you here in a basement in London. We presented these results extensively throughout the Eastern Rainforest in our study area and had some really, really valuable feedback. So I want to thank the communities, of course, our funders and all the many partners that went into a 7-minute summary. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Okay, so the next talk is from Horace, who is here at IED. So over to Ina.
So the title of my presentation, which I forgot, is basically the same title of a publication that we are just about to put out. We were trying to print it, but the ESPA beat us to it. It's going to be out quite soon. It's called Ecosystems, Poverty Alleviation and Conditional Transfers. So the premise of this is that for those of us who have been, as Steve kindly mentioned, in the environmental arena for many, many years, this is no news for us that ecosystems and nature provide many benefits. I grew up, one of my Bibles was this blueprint for green economics. I don't know if any of you remember that one. But then the environment fell off the agenda. It was one of these kind of interesting but not mainstream topics. And we now have, after so many years, 15, 20 years, we now have a lot of tools that have that enable us to actually put forward our case that ecosystems and nature are very, very important for wealth and for well-being as well. I quite like this one. I'm from Costa Rica, I forgot to mention this, and I'm very proud in my country. There's been a lot of a turnaround on the way that nature is managed, with good things and many bad things as well, but some of the most important things is how these investments are now paying off in the way that the country is run. The country, the electricity has been running on renewables for many, many days of the year now, ongoing. It was not just 1 year, it was not 100 days, it was 200, it was a year, and then it keeps going. These investments are paying, and people, it's improving the well-being of people. Whether that is improving the well-being of the poorest people is a different thing that we want to also examine. So one of the things that we wanted to do in this work that we did was to look at payments for ecosystem services, and especially conditional transfers of a wider nature that look at environmental outcomes but also social outcomes, and more specifically poverty alleviation. What can we learn from projects that are trying to implement this type of instruments, but not just doing it a little bit, a little scheme, a little project. We want to see what happens when you do it at scales, at large scales, at the scale where that when you come to talk to a Minister of Finance, they will listen. They will stop what they're doing and listen, because we're talking about significant amounts of money. So in these cases, the specific economic instrument we looked at are conditional transfers that are, as the word says, is conditional on an activity that is done, a positive activity that is expected to have good positive externalities on the environment. And it's also a positive reward for good actions. So it's not a tax, for example. We're talking about positive rewards, an incentive, a subsidy, like Julia mentioned before. And very importantly, it has to make economic sense for the provider of these ecosystem services. So it's not, we're not talking about compulsory or obligatory situations where people are worse off than what they were before. And also really important, one of the interesting aspects of this type of instrument is that it opens the avenue for new sources of financing linked to all of this environmental agenda. So we're talking straight away, especially for governments, the potential of linking directly and actively, and not as a lazy approach, the social protection and environmental agendas. Straight away we can begin to work really hard and see the potential crossovers from social departments and environmental departments in ways to deliver these positive actions for people on the ground. We have to talk about environmental tax reform. That's going to be one of the first things that countries have to do to be able to liberate some of these resources and allocate them in actions that contribute towards better environment, towards climate change activities. There's a lot of work done on direct deals at local level. We're seeing examples of programs that are scaling down from governments to local communities, but also we see increasingly examples of replication and scaling out. So we have very specific systems for carbon, for community carbon, for ethical carbon, for watershed agreements, that they follow a system and it's being replicated in many places and is achieving scales now. Conservation investment as well, it's increasing all the time. And I was at the Natural Capital Wealth, what's it called? The Wealth, thank you, quite a mouthful. And they kept talking about all of these trillions of money that are coming for natural capital. And we couldn't find a pinpoint exact examples that really will be helping poverty, for poverty alleviation. Environment, maybe yes, green growth, potential, but the poverty alleviation point is still missing. So all of these trillions of money that is mentioned in green bonds and all of this type of investments, we still have to push for this funding to be also pro-poor. There's a lot of, in many countries, they really don't like to hear the word environmental tax reform. So also you need to begin thinking around these topics and how do you engage with this government. Sometimes even earmarked taxes that make a lot of sense. You take a percentage of the water taxes and put them into conservation of watershed. It makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of governments that are just completely against the idea of earmarking. So you have to begin thinking about potential ideas on how to do this. So we looked in this synthesis and this analysis that we identified, we looked at many different ways of generating these financial sources and how they operate and getting examples in the practice from these countries. The poverty alleviation component, we've been struggling quite a bit trying to understand how do we conceptualize these conditional transfers, and the way we see these is we see conditional transfers as one instrument within a wide range of other policy instruments, and they have to be adapted depending on the fragility of your ecosystems and how important they are, but also you have to really take into account your the person that you're talking about, if they are better off or wealthy people, if they are medium poor, or if they are what's referred as the ultra poor. And then in this case, you have to be careful how you design your instrument, because sometimes if you impose conditions, this conditionality of PES or conditional transfers on the ultra poor, you'll just make them worse off than they were before. So you have to be always thinking that it's not a straightforward solution. There's no easy, simple one. And it's what we refer to as the heterogeneity of ecosystem service providers that has to be built in the policy, in the program design. So what we did, we looked into many examples of conditional transfers that have reached scale, but we didn't look at the ones that have failed, and we didn't look at the ones that remain tiny. We were interested in the ones that are making it through. After these 15 years, 20 years, which ones are actually making it through, which ones are becoming large at large scales. And we got this selection, and then we went straight away to talk to these people that are managing these programs. And just now, I just wanted to finish talking very briefly. I was supposed to talk about the China eco-compensation program, but I ended up talking a lot more. It's a really interesting example. In 1998, there was a big flood, and it really shook the way that Chinese policymakers understood the watersheds, and it was really problematic. And it gave origin to the sloping lands conversion program, which was really about providing incentives to plant more trees. So it was very basic, very simple. And they didn't even have money, so they just had, it was a green green for grain, it was also called. So they just had a lot of grain from an excellent from somewhere else, and they just began to give it as a payment. Eventually, they ran out of grain and had money, so they kept going giving money instead of grain. But the program kept evolving, and it made sense. They began to learn. It was compulsory to begin with, and then they began to move into more voluntary activities. It was for planting trees in sloping lands, as the name implies, but after that, they began to put it in wetlands, and they began to engage in grasslands and many other ecosystem services. And then it eventually became the eco-compensation program, which is a very large scale. It's the largest program that uses eco-compensation, which follows the principle of payment for ecosystem services in the world, really. And it targets many different sectors, and it targets many other different ecosystems and types of provider, and it has gone through lots of processes as well. And at the moment, they are reaching this new this new whole concept of eco-civilization, which I'm sure you will know a lot more, and it's very impressive when seen from abroad, where the concept, the main underlying concept is green is gold, and that seeps through all the activities that they are trying to do. And eco-compensation is one of the instruments where they deliver this initiative. And poverty alleviation now is also built in. It has to respond to the principles of eco-civilization. With the Belt and Road Initiative, these principles are going to be underlying their all the activities that they are trying to do as they expand beyond China, and that's going to be one of the ways in which China is going to be influencing a lot the development of environmental policies in other countries. So watch the space. I don't know if it's going to be good or bad, but it's certainly the biggest PES case of the world, really. Thank you.
Thank you, Ina. Does anyone have any direct questions? Yeah, Steve.
Yeah, there was a very tasty looking diagram. It feels like it could be poisonous if you interpret it wrongly.
Yeah.
You've got one which had sort of rich people, regulatory approach, conditional transfers, pests, sort of ordinary people, and then unconditional transfers for the poor. Is that an observation? Is it a recommendation? What does that mean?
Yes, it's sort of put on the table to discuss as well. If you have limited resources, and a lot of the time, PES is also accompanied a regulation. So that's just the way it is. It's not usually either or, it tends to come together. If you have limited resources and wealthy people who are able to cope with this regulation, they shouldn't be getting these incentives, this money from a government that has limited resources. The medium poor will be probably the more likely to be able to satisfy these conditions. We're still talking about poor people, so they're not going to be better off. So this is the people that are potentially more likely to respond to these activities. And also, by working on them, you will prevent them from falling into the ultra poor. So in many of these case studies, we're working with poor people, but not the ultra poor. This is people who don't have land, who don't have access to technology, who don't have access to capacity building. So sometimes if you need to work with them, maybe the best way to do is not forget about PES really. Just go straight to other instruments. Work straight over trying to help and bringing up the conditions that will enable them to access the markets, to, as you were saying, the technology, the different type of the activities that they need. But the PES would probably just be more problematic in those cases.
I'm sure we'll come back to this in discussion. Thank you very much, Ina. So the next talk is from Nigel Asquith, who is going to talk to us about the watershed program.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening, everybody. I often feel I'm wearing two hats in this type of presentation because actually I was one of the people who designed this whole program, thought through the logic, thought through how this PES type program would work in Bolivia. But at the same time, I'm an open scientist who want to evaluate how well it's working, how badly it's not working, and how to improve it. So I have this weird dichotomy of, on the one hand, I think it's great because I designed it, on the other hand, it's got some problems. So basically, I enlist people like Julia to come and kind of do science for us, and Edwin sitting in the back who's done his PhD on this program, to kind of keep us honest and try and do some really good impact evaluation of what we do, assessment of what's working and what's not, but at the same time, hopefully improve it. So the idea between the research and the program we designed is to try and get a good relationship between implementation in the field and researchers. So what I'm going to talk about, I tried, because it's getting late, to put no data whatsoever into this presentation. I tried, but then the last minute I just had to put some in. But anyway, so I'm going to talk mainly about the scheme and how it's evolved and what it is, and hopefully that will build into the discussion later on about PS, conditional transfers, unconditional transfers, and other reciprocity type programs. But something we've evolved over the time that Watershed has been working, we've changed its name about 4 times from PES right at the start to Watershed now, as a development of thinking about what we're actually doing in the field and how things change and how it relates to people and how things don't relate to people. And what we found out in much of the developing world and much of Latin America, that simply the words, the concept of payments for ecosystem service just doesn't resonate. People just don't get the idea of paying for an environmental service. Whereas what we've developed since 2003 in Bolivia, we've now got partners working in Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru in the same model, is the concept of what we now call watershed. And watershed is much more of a philosophy than anything else. And it basically says that people who provide water share it. So the people who live upstream in the forest, they make sure their forest is intact. They share the water. But the people who live downstream and use the water, they need to share the benefits of having that water. So people who produce water share it, people who get benefits from water share the benefits. And that means that actually in all the watershed programs we have across 50 or getting close to 60 municipal governments in Bolivia, so about 15% of the country's governments run these types of schemes. We've got about another 35 similar programs in Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. We're now working with colleagues in the Upper Tequila on the border of Lesotho and South Africa to develop the same concept. So it's much more this philosophy. But the interesting thing is that while I say that it's not a PS, the actual one thing that we've learned over 12 years of implementing Watershed is that conditionality, we still think, is absolutely critical. And in some ways, conditionality is what differentiates PS, conditional transfers, from everything else we've done in the past. So while I back off from calling ourselves a PS, actually the concept of conditionality, we think, is what defines what we do. But it's a weird type of conditionality we can talk about later. But just going back to Steve's question, we just started a randomized controlled trial following on from our ESPA work, where we're literally testing, giving people incentives, and half the people were saying, if you don't do conservation in return for these incentives, there'll be ramifications. And the other group would say, here's some stuff we hope you do conservation. So the idea of we're actually going to be testing the conditionality. But anyway, going back to Watershed as a program. People who live in these forests, protect them, share the water, and then people who benefit from sprinkler irrigation, get the water to produce their crops, they share some of the benefits. No? Now, another complicating factor in much of Latin America is that many people in this mix of, they have some forest upstream and they live downstream, and so they kind of do bits of both. They can protect their own forest, but what they want to do is get benefits from that water supply. So we have people like these guys, Geraldo here. He lives in the Bolivian Chaco. He's signing a contract here, or we call it an agreement, we don't call it contracts. And he's agreed to protect the forest behind his farm, and in return he's getting all this plastic tubing to help with irrigation, improve his irrigation system. So he is actually, by protecting his own forest, he's protecting his own water supplies, and hence will get a benefit from protecting his own forest as well. And then behind these three gentlemen who are in this ceremony for receiving their benefits, behind them is an area called the Serra de los Milagros, which is a mountain range. And once we convinced these guys to protect their forests here, we said, oh, actually, you know, protecting a small patch of forest isn't the real issue. How about this mountain chain behind, which is where the water really comes from? So what we found is by setting up small, tight PES deals, we then open the door that people say, oh, well, actually, conservation, I can benefit from something. Hey, let's go a step further and protect a whole protected area. So basically, people like Geraldo get plastic tubing to help with irrigation. Other things they can get is fruit trees, produce apples, pears, whatever. And in return for all this, they agree to conserve 10 hectares, 50 hectares, 25 hectares, whatever they want. It's usually a small piece of land. Communities can end up protecting more land, but it's very individualized, absolute bottom up. Now, the other thing, what we're very careful to make sure that the type of compensation, the fruit trees or the irrigation piping, or in the next one is the honey production, that all these are alternative livelihoods that not only diversify incomes, but diversify incomes away from climate susceptible agriculture to a diverse funding income stream which is less susceptible to climate change. And so, for example, if you look at the fruit tree versus or in addition to getting honey production, those two livelihoods are incredibly complementary in the sense of if you get a cool winter, you get much greater fruit production and much lower honey production, and vice versa. So we're trying to build up resilience in communities in a kind of bottom-up way in which they benefit from protecting their forest. Now, as I said, it's really small scale. And we really focus nothing on the concept of PES, because it's alien to many people, nothing on the concept of opportunity cost, nothing on the concept of the economic logic, simply the idea that if you protect your forest, you're going to help out your friends and family and other people in the community who live downstream, and in return these guys need to do something to you. I scratch your back and you scratch mine, is the deal. And we make a big deal. Here we have one of the compensation events. They're getting barbed wire to better manage their cow. We're having a big party. We have a song and dance. There's always food. Really building this concept of PES or conditional transfer as part of a community bonding mechanism. But once you get a whole bunch of people doing a lot of small stuff, once there's a whole lot of people doing small stuff, it suddenly gets bigger. So right now, as of the end of last year, we've got about 335,000 hectares of land under watershed agreements in Bolivia, which as I mentioned is in 15% of the region municipalities. 6,000 people like Geraldo live upstream, get the plastic tubing, get the bee boxes, get the fruit trees. I mentioned that he and his colleagues decided and pressured the municipal government once they'd seen that this was actually working them, hey, we should create protected areas too. So we created about 1.4 million hectares of protected areas. And downstream, the folks who live downstream are putting in about 225,000 people are actually contributing. Now, these are what Ina mentioned there. The upstream people aren't really the ultra poor, they're medium poor. And these folks downstream are also pretty poor, they're not well off. But this is the interesting thing. They decided to contribute. And I think last year, what was it? The local people downstream put in about $250,000 across the municipalities to pay to get better water supply. So if poor people can do that, why can't the rest of us? Is one that we like to ask. So, basic concept, the folks who live up in the forest protect it, make sure there's water downstream for the people who use it. Now, here's where we go into a little bit of research. So, this is hydrology research. This gentleman is Conrado Tobon, one of our ESPER researchers from the University of Colombia, Medellin. He set up some hydrology, similar to Mark Mulligan's work in Madagascar that Julie mentioned earlier, and basically concluded, as much as scientists ever conclude things, concluded that in this part of the world, we get 600 cubic meters of water extra per hectare if it's conserved versus a grassland. There's a million caveats behind that, but that was enough for us to say, okay, 600 cubic meters of water extra per year if you keep the forest. Now, we were then able to go to Coca-Cola, whose corporate policy globally is to say, well, we put all the water that Coca-Cola as a company uses internationally, we're going to put it back into the watershed. And Coca-Cola decided that their corporate strategy is to put that water back in anywhere. They don't need to be around their bottling plants. So they were willing to fund the program in which basically this lady's Coca-Cola Peru, this gentleman's Coca-Cola Bolivia, and these gentlemen are the mayors of 4 upstream municipalities who've been running this watershed program for the last 5 years very successfully, conserving a lot of land. And basically, Coca-Cola said, okay, we'll fund you to keep it going. So Coca-Cola is now paying 95% of the scheme for water conservation in this part of the world. Here's the one data slide I was going to show you. Oh, Julia, do you want to explain it? Well, one of the big questions we had, and this was interesting also, these guys in Coca-Cola, this lady, corporate person, I explained to her about how much water comes from hectare forest, and, well, we need to make sure that forest wood protection is actually additional. And a lot of people in the conservation community really don't get this concept of additionality, but these guys just get it totally immediately, the idea that if you're protecting a piece of land that wouldn't have been cut down anyway, then you're actually not achieving anything. So is your conservation additional to business as usual? And these guys go, well, like, we're not going to fund anything that isn't additional. So we need hectares that are producing water, and we need hectares that are additional. So, very briefly, some work that Julian, her postdoc, and various students in Bangor did, basically asked the question through a number of surveys, went to people who'd signed these agreements. And basically, correct me if I'm wrong, Julia, but this is a story. The basic words, in a long interview, would basically say, in a very casual way, this is all self-reported data. Well, you signed this agreement, you said you're going to conserve, but could cows actually have gone into this land where you conserved? Or is it suitable for agriculture? And a lot of the guys go, nah, not really, no. So if that's the case, it's not additional. If they couldn't have done agriculture there, it's not additional conservation. And this line is for the question on cows, this line is for the question on agriculture. But what we found out of the 429 people who'd signed contracts to keep their cows out of the riverbank, 120 of them said, well, actually, the cows couldn't have gone in there anyway. So that's not additional. Right? But then the next question later on, as the survey went on, they said to people, okay, well, fine, you put the land under conservation, but did you actually conserve it? Tell me the truth. Did you actually do it? And a bunch said, well, not really. So that's not additional either. Even though they signed up, it was suitable for land, they didn't actually do the job. So it's not. So we kicked those people out of the analysis. Then the next question, the final question was, so we've gone from 429 people who signed conservation contracts to keep cows out of the land. 121 of them, the cows couldn't have gone in there anyway. 34 of these guys didn't comply with the contract. So now you have, at the end of the day, we've got 274 people still there. And they were asked, well, what are you going to do after the program? Are you going to conserve it? And some people say, well, actually, I'm going to conserve anyway. So that's not additional either. They conserve without the compensation payment. So it turns out that at the end of the day, of the 429 people who signed conservation agreements to keep cows out of the forest, you don't need to look at this one, 30% of those are additional. Which means for every 100 hectares that are under these agreements, 31 of them are additional. Which actually doesn't sound much, but that actually compares quite well with other programs around the world. So it means for every 100 hectares we sign on contracts, 30% of them would have been cut down, or in this case would have had cows go in if it hadn't been for the program. So this was just a flavour of the type of research that's been done around the program. The whole idea that we've been working with Julia, with Edwin and various other people, is to say to ourselves, I work for an implementing NGO that tries to do stuff. So let's use the science, and ESP has been a really great funder for us in this, to try and use the scientific methodology to improve what we do and feed back into the NGO and do a better job next time. And I must say that the ESP has been really good in that, and we've had an amazing experience of getting much better programs because of this research. So thanks. Any questions?
Thank you, Nigel. We will move on to the final talk, which is from Bhaskar Vera. And there is Bhaskar's title. Bhaskar is from the University of Cambridge, and he's going to talk us about some of the political economy issues.
Thank you, everyone, and thanks for being here. I realize I'm the last person speaking, so I'll try and make it relatively quick. And actually, the three speakers before me have already touched on many of the political economy issues which come through. So I think I'm going to sort of reinforce their messages rather than say anything profoundly new, I suspect, especially with the sort of wealth of experience that's already before you. I think it's important to recognize that when we're looking at some of these questions, there are always going to be trade-offs. Some of the early optimism around the skills that we're talking about used a language of win-win, and that's kind of the holy grail of all international development efforts, surely. Let's find that one scheme in which everyone is better off. And of course, the reality of the world that we live in, the world that we implement, is that there are trade-offs. Some people gain more than others, some people lose. We've got to try and understand that the world is actually characterized by trade-offs of different types. And in the context of what we've been looking at in the course of this afternoon, when you have people inhabiting a watershed which is shared in different ways and they occupy different places within economic and political power structures, the likelihood is that people aren't necessarily going to benefit equally. And we've seen examples of this already from the evidence that's been presented. So I think that's one important point for us to keep in mind, that as a person who calls himself a political economist, when I hear the idea of win-win, I want to probe a little bit more deeply. I'd love to see them, but they don't always happen. You've heard about the sort of diversity of intervention types, and I think that has already come through. Nigel has talked about how their programs themselves, in terms of the language they've used, have evolved over time, and I think that's really important, and it's important to see the reflection that goes on in an implementing organization when it's engaging with people who like or don't like particular ways of framing the concept. But when we're looking at sort of these relationships between people who share a landscape, share a watershed, and how they can be characterized, the work that we've been doing finds that there are some which are conditional, some that are not necessarily based on conditionality. So there's a lot of social practice that's been going on where people are sharing, villages are sharing water, but there's not necessarily conditionality associated with that sharing practice. There are others which were the sort of classic original payments for ecosystem services, where the sort of concept first originated, where you had up and downstream transactions, and you had payments, and they were conditional, and there was sort of, there was a sort of set of very specific conditions within which those were. And then the reciprocity idea, I think, comes closest to Nigel's watershed idea, where reciprocity philosophically expresses the same thing as watershed, which is that there are people who have reciprocal relationships, obligations to each other. Payments feels like a one-way transaction. Someone is paying somebody else. Rewards also, kind of in my mind, feels one way, whereas reciprocity recognizes the two-way transaction. Sharing recognizes the two-way transaction. But what that means is that the words matter. And actually the words matter particularly when they're translated into other languages. We're talking in English here. Some of these words, when they translate, become quite odious when they kind of, the idea of payment in certain languages creates a sort of commodified relationship which isn't necessarily appropriate in certain contexts. So I think those words do matter. They're more than just labels. And ESPA over this kind of decade has explored a range of these concepts, and I think it continues to be work in progress. It's really interesting to see all of that coming through, where we're not necessarily, when the group of us were planning this event, in the emails that were going around, we would say, oh yeah, the PES event in February, and I sort of said, well, we've gone past calling it a PES, so why are we calling it a PES event? It's an event around these kind of shared reciprocal arrangements, and I don't think we have the terminology right yet, but it's work in progress, and it's important to recognize. So this is talking about the sort of diversity, and it links to Ina's point about regulation at one end of the spectrum. So this is what we did quite accidentally. I went for a conference to Salt Lake City, and this is the Wasatch watershed, which is above Salt Lake City. And in that watershed, they have a shared agreement, because that watershed supplies for Salt Lake City, 2 million people with its water. It's been implemented through regulation. It was declared as a forest reserve for water in 1906 by Roosevelt. And it's protected as a forest reserve for water. The US Forest Service, which operates in that area, sees the delivery of water to Salt Lake City as its primary goal. Not the protection of the forest, it's the delivery of water to Salt Lake City. But there are no payments being made by the residents of Salt Lake City to the US Forest Service. It operates under a sharing agreement. There's a mountain accord, which is a sort of multi-stakeholder partnership. And it's an example of the fact that, in certain contexts, old-style regulation can still work, and this is intact. The reason why the example is important is that it's an interesting counterpoint to the very famous New York example, which launched all of the PES interest. So in the US, there are other cities that are protecting their watersheds in other ways. It's not just PES arrangements. And that's interesting and important because in some ways, this is an example of what we used to call the polluter pays principle. People downstream, Salt Lake City, have the right to clean water. And the regulation ensures that the polluter is punished if they actually... So there are restrictions on people taking their dogs into this catchment, there are restrictions on, things that pollute the catchment are restricted. A lot of what PES is doing is to say the beneficiary should pay. So you're reversing a polluter pays principle and making it a beneficiary pays principle. Salt Lake City has to pay for water would be a beneficiary pays principle. And that's an important philosophical question. Is it right for the polluter to pay or is it right for the beneficiary to pay? And again, something we might come back to. We worked in ESPA-funded work in the Western Himalayas. We were working in 6 towns, small towns in Nepal and India, and this is a very quick overview of trying to understand how changes in the landscape were impacting water supply in that landscape, and the ultimate beneficiaries of that were the small towns further downstream. We had a couple of examples where there were incipient agreements. I don't think they were strictly conditional in the sense that we've had in some of the other cases. One in this small village in Gohal near Kuala Lumpur is an agreement, but it's a transfer of resources from the municipal council up to the village. There is low-level monitoring, but there's very little conditionality. It's a collective agreement, so individuals' behavior is not necessarily monitored. And as long as the forest looks reasonably intact, they get the next year's payment. So it's an agreement, there is some reciprocity, there's an understanding that what's happening up in that forest is impacting water downstream, so it's kind of certainly about shared water. But it departs a lot from our sort of strict definitions of what a PES might look like. And then what we found is that obviously, as agreements like this come in, local politics start to intervene. So a lot of what we found was that there was local political mobilization, some groups were excluded, other groups were benefiting. You got micropolitics, you would expect that, In Nepal, in one of our other case studies, there is an agreement between the town downstream, Holy Grail, and the upstream providers. There's a sum of money which gets transferred. But then we started to look at what happens to the beneficiaries downstream. Does everyone get water? Does everyone get enough water? So trying to sort of recognize that there's a political economy even amongst the downstream community. What we otherwise sometimes end up doing is to talk about aggregate supply. You might improve the aggregate supply, but then there's this further political economy question about within the downstream beneficiaries, who is benefiting and how much are they benefiting by. Interesting sort of collective decision-making structure in this town has agreed progressive water tariff structure. So it's in slabs, and the lowest water consumers pay the least, which means the poorest people pay the least, and the heavy water consumers, which are things like hotels, pay the most. So there's a kind of interesting decision-making structure which reflects some of those political economic concerns. So just thinking about various trade-off issues that we've encountered in the course of the work we've been doing between up and downstream people, within upstream people, within downstream people, there's a whole range of questions that someone like me would then be able to talk about at much greater length as core bread and butter questions around political economy. So, what about poverty alleviation, and to what extent do these schemes deliver pro-poor outcomes? I think the obvious starting point, and that's evident again from so many of our interventions, starting from Julia's and all the others, that you can't assume that a scheme like this will always benefit the poorest the most. It's not always going to be pro-poor. The distribution of benefits flow differently to different people in these landscapes. And often they might be excluded from either the design of the scheme or from the implementation of the scheme. So unless you're self-consciously looking to target them as potential beneficiaries, you can't assume that the benefits will necessarily flow. For them to benefit, they have to be included at the very least in the way in which the scheme is thought about and designed, so that you've got that kind of range of well, it links, I suppose, to some extent to Ina's slide about you've got the very poor on the one hand, you've got the medium poor, and you've got the slightly wealthier. You've got to think about the fact that the beneficiaries of these programs, both up and downstream, are not homogeneous. So we've got to think about how those programs might separately impact the different communities, both up and downstream. Thank you.
Good. Well, thank you very much, panel. That's been a wonderfully rich and varied lot of material on this really complicated topic. It sounds very simple, but as you can see, there are many dimensions to it. There are dimensions about who gets the benefits, who's paying the cost, at what scale, what kind of organisation is involved, and whether these agreements are in some way enforced through regulation, whether they're negotiated into contracts, or whether they're just in some way reciprocal negotiated agreements between different partners. And all of this in the context of, are they really reaching the poorest people? And are they achieving better environmental status, better environmental conditions on which the poorest people may most directly depend? So a rich lot of material to think about. So who would like to kick off with anything? Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, that was really interesting. I happen to have written my master's thesis with Fundación Natura, where Nigel comes from, with the NGO that he and Teresa put together 10 years ago on Los Negros, which is I think the first PS project in Bolivia. And I remember when I was interviewing people about the reason why they would participate in this project in the upstream areas was not because they were very aware they were not getting the same amount of money or equivalent to what they were losing, but it was more about the fact of being able to learn how institutions work, how to produce honey, and for nutritional purposes to feed their kids. So that was interesting because there was a very strong awareness, and the result of what I wrote in the end, or I analyzed, was that there has to be, the PS projects often work well when they're combined with those elements that go beyond economistic thinking. And so my question, maybe in 10 years after, I'm also from Bolivia, after 10 years of these projects, has there been any, that's for Nigel, has there been any studies done in terms of the social benefits for people, especially living in upstreams? And obviously your presentation has focused a lot on the environmental benefits. I guess there has been as well some studies done in terms of the amount of water that's going down, but has there been anything properly to understand what social benefits are? And I guess what Ina said before, which is really interesting, is I feel that in the studies that we, and in cases that we have in PS, there is a missing link of really understanding how PS links to pro-poor policies. And which is something that is really interesting because right now I'm working on SDGs and I want to understand how this can be combined. But yeah, so yeah.
Okay, so that is a direct question to Nigel, but I think it can be a broader question to the others about what these wider benefits are from the payment schemes,
right? Yeah,
the components of well-being. So I think you can generalise it out. Anybody else got a question to add in? Yes, go ahead.
Yes, so we've heard a lot today about the fact that we have to consider that beneficiaries are very heterogeneous. People have different amounts of money, different levels of social capital, different levels of resources, and so on. And how if we don't consider that, that can have very damaging unintended consequences potentially. So if that's the case, then does that imply that interventions as implemented must be are going to have to be made more complex to account for that? And if so, could it be the case that actually, in practice, accounting for all these things, attempting to make sure that nobody does lose out, makes them almost too complex to be feasible and too complex to be functional? And if then that is the case, what do we as researchers and practitioners do?
Okay. Steve, have you got that? That's the second one. We'll take one more.
This is sort of kind of simpler, really. It's lovely when you get these kind of almost spontaneous deals being done between upland and low. And I remember years ago in Pakistan, apple farmers kind of realised that the Ziyarat forest upstream was giving them decent water. And they did a deal between people living upstream and themselves. And I remember the forest department, the Balochistan forest department, just sort of picking up, oh, actually this shows that people value forests for water too. It slightly influenced the policy discussion. So I just wonder, from all of these things, particularly all your kind of mini things, Nigel, with all these different deals where people can see sense, can these add up to some kind of refreshing of policy discussion about general environmental governance? You know, general environmental management, rather than some complex nationwide scheme. Do you think they inform people who are in charge of land and forests and uplands and downlands and agriculture more generally?
Do you want to understand the question? I'm not sure I do, but maybe you will.
So instead of just, we've got all these mini schemes, can they inform a big scheme?
Yeah.
Do they inform
wider
the quality of overall governance ideas?
Of the environment.
Oh, for the environment, yeah.
Okay. Okay, so those are three fantastic questions, actually all rather different to each other. So if we just go on the panel, you can answer any or all of them as you want, but feel free to spend time on the one you think you've got most to say about, and but not too much time. So Nigel, given that that was directly at you to begin with, shall we start with you?
Well, I actually wanted to bounce this question of our social benefit studies to Edwin and Julian, because we have collected through the randomized control trial, we have potloads of data of communities which received the conditional schemes and communities that didn't. So we've cleaned all those data, sitting there, what's going on? And Edwin, if you could butt in about the health, because that has been analysed, health impacts of conserving land. I don't think that the RCT's shown anything, no, but
yeah.
Okay, we haven't got all evening. So yeah, just to be. Yeah, but go ahead.
No, in the Santa Cruz Valleys area, we did find there was quite a strong link between, as we would expect, but it was good to be sort of reassured by that levels of forest conservation, especially in levels of damaging activities, particularly in upstream catchments, did lead to, if you had that in upstream catchment, you had then higher levels of E. coli in community water supplies, which then did lead to higher levels of waterborne disease amongst children in those communities.
And just to give a very quick answer on the social analysis, sorry Nigel, it's not fully analysed yet. So, and actually you said one thing that was very interesting, you suggested the analysis so far that Nigel talked about was looking at environmental outcomes. I don't think Nigel didn't actually say anything about environmental outcomes and quantification of that, and hot off the press, as in we're finalising, hoping to submit a paper in the next few days, weeks, hopefully days, is an analysis that we've done based on the RCT design that has shown that watershed has a significant effect on reducing deforestation, and we were actually quite surprised that we'd get a measurable effect. There's all sorts of things that affect deforestation, but there is and whatever stats we do, we can't get rid of the effect, so we're pretty confident that there's a real but small effect of watershed on reducing deforestation. So that's a sort of new result, so I thought it was worth mentioning, but it's not a social outcome. It has genuinely changed something. So Nigel highlighted that at least some of these contracts are additional, and if that's true, we would expect that to filter through to an effect at the landscape scale, and we have detected that.
Okay. Nigel, did you want to comment on the other?
Maybe Steve's question, which I think is interesting. When we look at this program that's developed on a I guess, a political question of can you add up thousands of little things to be one big thing and that have a policy impact, and then does it have a wider, broader impact on the policy debate? I think what we're learning is yes, but Bolivia is a very difficult country to work in terms of its politics. Anything that remotely smells of payments, fees and services, they just don't want anything to know. But I think what we've learned is by banging our heads against this brick wall for 10 years, finally that wall is beginning to crumble, and our policy has been right from the start. As soon as 20% of a population doing anything, it becomes self-sustaining. So we're trying to get 20-25% of all the municipalities in the country doing this, and the idea that then that turns not into just policy about the particular program, but the idea that then suddenly everyone is going to national government and say, well, we want to protect our water sources, and they're doing it in 20% of the municipalities, so how do you help us do it too? So as part of that long-term theory of change, that is exactly what will happen. Bolivia is a difficult country to make that happen. But that's maybe why in the Bolivian sense, it's in some respects easy to work from the bottom up to the top. In other countries where it's much more centralized decision-making structures, very, very difficult for this kind of policy experimentation that we've been able to do at a local level to ever get up to national level, because the national government says, well, we're going to do that. It's not part of, like the Indian Forest Department. There's no way you can do policy experimentation in India, no?
Okay, Ina.
I'm going to follow on that as well, because that comes to one of the big topics that was also discussed in the World Forum for Natural Capital. There's all of these apparent investors lining up with all of this money, and they're looking for interesting projects, and they want examples of things that are fantastic on the environment and help people and all of these things, but they want them to be standardized, and they want them to be a larger scale so that it makes sense to invest millions. So we're not talking about little bits of barbed wire and this. We need to be able to aggregate all of these little things into something big where a big investor can come in. The problem of doing that is that you lose that local level engagement. It's really difficult. One of the questions that we had when we began looking into the synthesis of this study was to think about these scaling out possibilities. We're looking at really interesting watershed reciprocal agreements examples. We're looking at carbon offsets as well. There's a lot of really interesting cases of ethical carbon offsetting with very straightaway links to SDGs, a lot of potential, but is this scalability to make it into an investable, big, large scale? That's the bit that we're still missing, and we need to work on that. Because the danger will be to say that we just take that and then pack it up and then make the lazy solution and say we're going to be expanding this, there will be a win-win. I think that we need to look a little bit more into that, and we need to really make sure that we now have to begin engaging with the finance sector, the financial sector. We're going to have to just get more into banking. I'm just going to respond really quickly to the other one on the complexity question, because that also comes back to when we deal with poor people and scattered. And one of the ESPA projects that we had also was looking into carbon value chains for smallholder and community projects. And we wanted to evaluate different levels of monitoring for carbon, from very complex to just sort of very basic. And we found that even a very basic measurement was sufficient to generate enough information, and it's enough robust science without having to go too complex. And so one of our conclusions is to resist the temptation to be more complex. The problem is that the solutions that come from the top, they want uniform solutions, and they want them very complex, and that excludes immediately all of these smallholder community projects. So what we need to do is bring this evidence that says, okay, no, we don't need complex systems. We can get away and sufficiently robust with this type of initiative, but we need to see how we make that jump from one to the other.
I mean, the complexity and the scaling up and down are interrelated.
And I'd actually like to comment on the scaling up question from what Ina said, because Ina's point I think is really important. So you need to go from, it's all very well showing that a scheme at the scale that Nigel is operating is successful. Does that mean it can be scaled up? So one of the questions, one of the graphs, the little kind of complicated map thing that Nigel showed is from a paper that we've written on the importance of motivation. So we've looked, ultimately, the point of those different models that we were laying out in that sketch was to say, okay, when we're looking at additional parcels of land, what has motivated the people that have joined? What we care about is additionality. So what motivates the people that have actually produced additional conservation? That's the purpose of that paper. And what we found was really interesting, is that the kind of people that are motivated to join, the motivations of the people that join and produce additional conservation is very different from the motivation of the people that join, they get the benefit, but they're not actually producing any conservation. Now, motivations are highly variable and very affected potentially by their actual experience of engagement with the scheme. Now, Natura have this highly motivated, really kind of dynamic team on the ground who are all inspired by direct contact all the time by the leaders of this organisation who are visionaries of this kind of, they believe in the scheme. And that, of course, that positivity spreads down through the organisation. That's quite hard to scale up. So that is a really good question, is if it moved from being something where the kind of leadership of the organisation is kind of really kind of felt by all of the people that are engaging with the scheme on the ground to something that was more sort of corporate, high level invested in, a bit more kind of the same everywhere it was done, less adaptable to local conditions. The question of whether its effectiveness would stay there is very, very questionable. You can't automatically assume it's been successful at this scale, it'll work at a larger scale. So that was a quick response to that question, that point that Ina made. I just want a quick response actually to Edwin's one about interventions being more complicated to make sure that you fully differentiate people. Just to kind of give another shout out to some ESPA research that came out from our project in Madagascar. And that looked explicitly at the transaction costs of different schemes to deliver micro-development projects to people in the forest frontier. And one of the schemes they looked at was the safeguard compensation, which is the most complicated. It has the obligation to actually identify who is bearing opportunity cost and then ensure they benefit and they get these micro-development projects and they get the funding themselves directly and not to everybody in a community who's potentially affected. And what they showed was the transaction costs of those safeguard compensation schemes were, I can't remember the orders of magnitude, but it was so much higher. And then the research I've already mentioned showed it failed anyway at actually reaching the right people. It still suffered very strong elite capture. So the point we would make there is, I don't have an answer, but it's not as simple as I'll just design a scheme that's targeting the poor, because it's very hard to actually reach the poor because elite capture happens at every level. Everyone in these communities is poor, but as we all know, there's poor and there's poor, and it's very hard to make sure that the right poor benefit. So just another. So that's a paper that's coming out quite soon, I think, in environmental conservation.
A couple of quick ones. So, Steve, your question, the way I was hearing you speak, it was, there are these really interesting, innovative kind of reciprocal things going on. People see that there's mutual dependence. How does that kind of inform wider environmental governmentality? How do people kind of incorporate that into their thinking? So one of our case study towns is a small town in Himachal Pradesh called Rajgarh, which has its water source is 14 kilometers away from the town in an existing wildlife sanctuary. So again, at some point the Irrigation and Public Health Department, which runs water schemes in Himachal Pradesh, discovered that there's this water source. It put 14 kilometers of pipelines to transport water from that sanctuary to the town. It now supplies the town for water. There isn't any, there's no conditional payments, there's no sort of payment mechanism, but clearly the existence of a healthy sanctuary is quite important for this town to continue to get its water. The wildlife sanctuary is managed by the Forest Department. The Forest Department has a management plan for the wildlife sanctuary. It doesn't mention water at all. Has absolutely no recognition that there's a town downstream whose entire water supply is actually dependent on the continued good health of that national park. So I think that's maybe something along the disconnect that you're talking about, that there are these kind of innovative things going on. Some irrigation engineer discovered a water source, put in some pipes, has now got a sort of formal water supply scheme going there. But the people who are really responsible for the health of the forest department, have absolutely no conception that this matters. And it's not in their frame of reference. The government will not expect the forest department to deliver water. That's not what they're responsible for. They need to make sure that they police the boundaries of the national park, which is a completely different kind of, So, and this is a management plan which was written in the last 2 or 3 years. So the scheme is impossible to ignore because there's a massive pipeline coming out from. So, I think that's maybe something along the lines that you're getting at. Not an answer, but it's kind of, it expresses the disconnect, that there's this compartmentalized thinking. And how do you find ways to integrate that across all the elements of government that are involved. On scaling up, I think, Julia, your point is really important. I mean, so many of the really successful ideas which are out there, innovative interventions in environmental development, are driven by the sorts of charismatic individuals that Nigel, and others, people who've got interesting ideas, are committing to them, are implementing them with real dedication. And then we say, great idea, let's have 10,000 such Nigels. You can't find 10,000 Nigels, I'm afraid to say. It's really difficult. So it is very difficult then when we talk about that scaling up point to replicate the human ingredient that makes the pilot so successful.
Could I just quickly respond to that? I think though, we've just done some numbers, we've concluded that more or less it costs about $25 a hectare to do this, everything included, all that transaction cost to deliver it. And about 5 of that probably goes to the community members. That's incredibly costly. If we're spending, what's that 80% of the cost of the project is on transaction costs.
Yeah.
That's not sustainable. The DIF is going to stop funding us soon, and everyone else. It's not. It has to be scaled. The only way I think that we can morally look at this and ethically is that we've done a pilot now, which has shown that it has an impact, however small. It can work. It can be scaled at one level. If we don't now figure out how to scale it properly and then reduce that transaction cost down much lower, then we're.
But it's not just technical transaction cost. It's, I think, what Julia was getting at was that there's a human element to the implementation.
Right.
So if you're describing the model of implementation, you have to describe within it that you need an enthusiastic implementer.
But that's the challenge. How do we get to that? We have to automate to scale and reduce those transaction costs down. And if we don't, how do you,
But I guess you're dealing with sort of human interactions where automation doesn't always work. So, I think that's the
that comes back to the complexity question, is that if each agreement needs to be separately negotiated around the particular needs and demands of the people involved, then you end up, it just doesn't scale up by definition without the big transaction. I don't know how many contracts are involved in that.
We've got about 6,000 contracts.
Well, there you go. I mean, that is a lot of contracts.
Yeah, but if I may just convince it, that ESPR gave us that ability because we came in learning how to do from a bunch of cowboys doing these amazing little deals, and to turn our program into a research program, we had to automate, we had to standardize, and that was what allowed us to jump to. Okay, it's not huge scale, but it's medium.
But you've either got to have more contracts, or each contract involving more things.
Yes.
And both of those present problems. So, okay. Did either of you want to address the wider benefits question from either of the other projects?
No, what I wanted to address is my own question that I think we all wanted to discuss a bit more, because I felt Steve brought it up after Ina's presentation, and I think it would be nice, I don't know if other people in the room would like to go back to that diagram, because I'd really like to discuss that a bit more. So my comment on that was, well, I had 2 comments really. One is, so Ina made the statement that, what was it? Yes, Ina said, there you go. Ina said that the well-off shouldn't be getting conditional transfers, they should just be operating through regulation. At first I was trying to get to the question of, well, is that a kind of, it sort of sounds like a sort of normative statement of what should happen, rather than a pragmatic statement. So in the UK, for example, we use agri-environment schemes, which of course are a conditional transfer. And if we didn't do them, we wouldn't be incentivising all of the actions that we do care about for supplying ecosystem services that are beyond regulation, and whether it should always be regulation. But then the flip side is at the other end of the extreme, the idea that, I totally take your point, and I really appreciate the acknowledgement it gives to the fact that, the really poor, the kind of people that are affected, like by the Red Cross project I talked about in Madagascar, these are extremely poor. A plastic bucket is high technology in these communities. They're the absolute poorest of the poor, and our research very strongly shows that they are being negatively affected by coercion and environmental regulation. So I really appreciate the idea that those type of people really need help to adapt to any environmental change, to move away. But the question is, if we're suggesting that should happen without regulation, I'm wondering how realistic that ever would be, partly because of the question of, well, how do you stop just more people coming in to benefit? So if we're not, my view, and this is very naive probably and poorly thought through, is people like that, the only way we can really achieve conservation without really negatively affecting very poor people's well-being is through recognising land rights and then at some level trying to contract with them to kind of agree conservation, so kind of going towards this kind of model. But of course that has huge transaction costs and huge problems, and there are really big issues around land rights. So my question is, at both ends are kind of questioning the pragmatism of the far right end, and also the kind of, where does regulation come in, and at the far left end.
Yeah.
So before you answer that, let's just see if there's any other points on this issue, because it is a very tantalising diagram. Yeah, that's it.
My very brief comment was, clearly we're talking about, on your horizontal scale, it's not the same place. We're talking about not the ultra poor, medium poor, and better off in, let's say, a village. It's different schemes for different places. And keeping that in mind, the extreme right, better off, is where the polluter pays principle operates, regulation. And the middle is where the beneficiary pays principle operates. That's just my observation when I saw that. But that's just another observation.
Okay, I'll let you answer in a minute. Any other comments on this? Yes, go ahead.
I just wondered, actually, in a similar area, if you could think a bit more about some lessons then for designing for poverty alleviation, because several people have said that obviously poverty alleviation is not automatic, it doesn't necessarily happen. And you talked about designing for poverty alleviation.
So what does that mean? About this
it is a bit. Okay. I mean a bit, because obviously then conditional transfers is a way of designing for, but I wondered if there are any other lessons.
Okay, so I'll let you. Anybody else want to raise anything on this, and then on that? Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, just sort of drawing on the first and last talk and then applying it in the case in Bolivia with Nigel. You were talking some about, you're doing some studies on the social impacts. Did you also look at distributional issues within that study? And maybe I'm misunderstanding something here too, and about the voluntary nature of it, because I can see how participation is voluntary at the upstream level, but what about the consumers of water, water being an essential resource? What is the effect of, but I may not understand how the system works, charging a water user, and then how does that have distributional differences, maybe depending on the level of poverty? So how does it work if you're downstream, you want water, you must therefore pay? Or if you could elaborate a little bit more on that.
Okay. Let Ina answer about this diagram, and then we'll come back to the more general things.
Just very quickly, this graph has undergone several iterations, and unfortunately in this one I missed regulation in the other ones as well, because it was regulation and potentially unconditional transfers with a question mark, regulation and conditional transfers, regulation only as a suggestion, except that in the practice it is them who appropriate the payments. The regulation, what it tends to do once you introduce a rule that stops people from polluting or changing land use, it automatically reduces the opportunity cost of conservation. So that's a really useful thing, especially if you can only make a small payment, which is the case of Costa Rica, for example, where the cash payment from PES is good, but it will never be able to compete if there wasn't a strong law that stops people from deforesting. The law was there before, people were still deforesting, but they get better at monitoring. So now that there's a reward and the potential being caught, then there's more people who are willing to put up with that. Obviously, what is happening is the better off that appropriate the payments. If the government doesn't have enough resources, it will make a lot of sense for them to concentrate on the medium poor. The problem is that it's very difficult to implement that. Even constitutionally, we tried so hard in Costa Rica to get them to think around this poverty issue. And we couldn't, because the constitution cannot differentiate the owners. And it was so difficult to help them think through poor people within the PES program in Costa Rica. It's really hard, even identifying this. But in theory, is if they are better off and there's a regulation, then we apply polluter pays principle, and we should just do it in that way. The middle ones, I find it more difficult, then we help them to stick to the regulation. And then with the ultra poor, we find other ways of trying to help them comply with regulation. And then you will notice that in the lower bit, there's nothing, as Nigel has said. Why do we even have it in there? One of the points is that at the moment we're focusing the study on high ecosystem importance areas, so areas of fragility or high importance. If they are not very important, if they are not at risk, or from an ecosystem point of view, then we're not looking into them at the moment. So that was why we began using that. And then, if, of course, you have poverty issues, but then you just go with social protection, if that's what you need to do with those groups. It's in that upper level where you have the potential of combining environmental and social instruments. But yes, regulation should have gone across.
If we can have the longer discussion over a glass of wine later, but if you want something for your bottom left corner, I would personally put the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act of India in there.
Yes. We even, you know, of all the 10, 12 programs that we reviewed, we have tried to put them on the different boxes.
But I mean, a lot of where the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act is working is in places which are of very low ecosystem importance. It's kind of, you know, dry lands in the middle of the country. And I don't see that as a conditional transfer program. It's an entitlement program. It's a social security program.
Yeah.
So actually, if you want something to fix that box problem, it'll fit in that box.
And actually, if you have some diagonal lines, you have the regulations sitting up there across in the top corner,
I kept
and you
trying to
have the
think
social
3D.
payments, contract payments sitting in the bottom left-hand corner. That may look better. Okay, have we dealt with all the things that were... So there was the question about distributional...
Yeah, I want you to talk about elite capture, because that's kind of that's the other kind of... If you look at 70 years of developmental intervention since the Second World War, I mean, elite capture has been around all the time. We know that communities are differentiated. You introduce fantastic schemes, and those who are politically and economically powerful capture it. And it was targeted at the poor, but it's actually the powerful who've taken it over. So we've known that for a very long time. And I think it's important to recognize that. Now, Julia's question is, can we deal with it? Because some targeting schemes don't seem to succeed either. You know, they identify the ultra poor, they try and target their benefits, and they need to come along and circumvent those schemes in any case. You know, so there are, you know, these are complex social institutions that have created inequality in these societies, and these are unequal societies, and inequality reproduces itself. So for an external intervention to be able to overturn those long-standing structural reasons why inequality exists is always going to be problematic. I think so I worry about design documents. You know, so many of these programs have these really well-written program design documents which seem to magically think that 70 years of social inequality can be overturned by a sort of 2-year intervention. And I think we should just have to be honest that it's not going to necessarily happen. That doesn't mean we should stop trying, and it doesn't mean we should stop targeting. I mean, Edwin, in relation to your question around complexity, I mean, do we try and target everybody and try and make everybody better off? I mean, I think my point about the political economy is that we'll never get to that holy grail of everyone's going to be better off. So then let's be actually quite explicit and say the only ones we care about are these people. And if others are worse off, that's fine, they can deal with it. They're wealthy enough and rich enough to deal with the consequences. Our program will focus exclusively on a small subset, and we will monitor outcomes only in relation to that small subset. If the poorest of the poor, this is the Rawlsian principle, if the poorest of the poor are not better off, the program has failed. And forget about monitoring anything else. And you could make those explicit choices. And I think, you know, in the context of things like SDG implementation, I think trying to kind of find that magical formula of how everybody can be better off, it's really not going to happen. And, you know, let's not pretend that it is. Let's actually be explicit about the fact that some people will be worse off. And actually the people that we're planning to make worse off are people who can bear that. And let's focus on the ones who don't have the capacity to be worse off, because they're most vulnerable. Move away from the language of win-win, even in the design. But that's hard work, because it's much easier to sell to a donor if it's win-win.
And some complex.
But I think
you want to comment on the distribution?
Well, yeah, to carry on with that. I think historically PS fits in that conditional transfer box. And we've been frustrated, or Ina and I have been talking about it, that there's so many other schemes out there that PS like, and so many people that could benefit from PS schemes that can't be in that conditional transfer box. So it actually doesn't help us as a research community just to focus on that box. And that's kind of, I think, where we're going with this. With the discussion. But also I'd like to back up your idea of design principles. That was one of the questions. What design principles come out? And the thing I wrote down is best design falls apart when it goes to the field. Which is kind of what you just said. And we find that in both good ways and bad ways. And I'll try to answer that in respect to the other question. I find it strange actually hearing you talk about elite capture, because we find the exact opposite in Bolivia. There's such strong perceptions of local concepts of fairness and reciprocity that when we come to this question of who pays for the water downstream and do the rich pay less, and the community structures there say, okay, we're going to vote on this. Everybody who's a water user votes on whether we'll increase rates, and the schools pay less, older people's pay less, the poor people less, etc., etc. It's very well designed in terms of poverty alleviation and helping the ultra poor. I think that's because of that cultural conflict. Again, the idea of good design falls apart when you're in the ground in terms of linking this unconditional and conditionality. I was in the field about a month ago, going to one of these events where we're giving the compensation. And this is one of our sites where it's in the RCT, which, as you probably know, has been designed up the wazoo. We have designed this so strict protocols. You can't say this, you can't say that. It's designed completely. And we as a foundation run it, but get some bits of funding from the local government to support it. So there I am, and we're giving out B boxes to a whole bunch of farmers that shake hands with this person. He's putting in 25 hectares and he's got the 5 B boxes, whatever it is. And then became this list of like 8 women, all of whom appeared to be young, unmarried women, and they all got 1 B box. And I'm like, it's not that all these young, unmarried women all have 5 hectares of forest they're putting into land. And the mayor just piggybacked onto our highly designed, highly specified, conditional transfer program. He took the advantage of being there to just lump in with it his unconditional program to these ladies so they can start producing honey as well. So our scientific RC just fell apart without me being told about it. But again, the idea that the unconditional transfers for those people who need it, the conditional transfers that the people who didn't need it, happened as I watched. And much to my, oh my God, what's going on in this other. Fortunately, the researchers I were with had gone earlier in the day, so they did say, don't tell them, please, because the whole RCT fell apart. But the local culture made it fall. And actually, as far as obviously my concern is, well, hold on, the guys who got the conditional transfers are going to say, well, hold on, I put this line in conservation, these guys get it for free. That doesn't seem to be a fear of those people. So maybe it's not, maybe it's just so. I don't know where that leaves it, but this idea of those 2 boxes on that top row, the unconditional and conditional, my sense is you need to define them specifically and don't try and mix them. As soon as we try and mix those unconditional transfers within our PS program, paying people but not forcing them to protect the forest, it kind of intellectually falls apart. But what I just saw a couple of weeks in the practice, it doesn't seem to. So.
Okay, we've probably got time for one more quick thing.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up this point that Nigel was making about transaction costs being 80%. I mean, that seems an astonishingly high figure. And I mean, it's always been my hunch that may be the case, but you've got data. I mean, I'm just wondering whether this watershed by watershed approach, which PS has adopted for so long, is essentially, a failure. And whether, as you've tried with Coca-Cola, as Ina's illustrated with some of these big social protection schemes like in China and so on, it's better to have a more top-down approach than trying these transaction cost heavy approaches.
So I think firstly you say it's an extraordinarily big figure, I said it's an extraordinarily honest figure, and I think it would be very easy for those figures, so I've seen the spreadsheet that Nigel's getting that from, and so in that they included things like a percentage of Nigel's salary, a percentage of Marie-Therese's salary, the very senior people in the organisation. Now, what do you include in those transaction cost estimates is how long is a piece of string. You can include anything you like. I think I was really relieved to see them as high as they were in that estimate, because I wouldn't have believed if they'd been any lower. So I think, yes, there's the criticism that this model is inherently expensive, but if you did a different model, it would be a very different thing. It's hard to, I think it would be very hard to do this very locally focused, very local engagement, flexible to the context type approach without it being inherently quite expensive. And I think that figure, you could have made that figure a lot smaller if you missed out the head office costs and just had the local office costs. Or, you could make that figure pretty much anything you like. But I don't think it's a surprising figure. But I do think it's a shock to kind of, we have to recognise that this thing is going to be expensive if you do that kind of approach.
And equally, the web project in Madagascar.
Oh,
well, giving $10 to a person or whatever, how much behind that?
So if you were to say, so we have a shortcut saying in my sort of group who work in Madagascar, we talk about shoe pastry swans and the cost of shoe pastry swans, because I did once go to a workshop where we were served shoe pastry swans, which I think just captures perfectly the completely unnecessary transaction costs going on behind the implementation of some of these large conservation programs. And that was the shoe pastry swans being had at a regional office in Madagascar, not unless the national office, not unless the Washington marble-clad headquarters. So it's costly to do stuff, really.
Yeah.
And I think you very, very, very seldom see those costs. So the paper I'm referring to that's coming out soon from the Pages project, I'm not a co-author. It's led by the CI team, and I know who've been involved in leading a lot of the micro-development projects in this Red Plus project. And I think they've been remarkably honest. I mean, I've not been involved directly, so I've never had my hands on the raw data underpinning it. But I know they themselves had a lot of discomfort. Are we just going to open ourselves to huge criticism when we publicise these figures? I think it was a very brave thing to do, because they're the only people that have the facility to actually say, how much has it cost us to implement these different schemes, and what's the relative spend that reaches the community relative to how much it's cost us to implement it for these different programmes. They were looking at these safeguard compensation schemes and comparing them with direct implementation of micro-development by their team, and comparing that with, they had for a while a kind of conservation agreement approach, and they were comparing these different approaches and making public their costs. And again, as I say, they're very high, particularly for these more complex, more targeted schemes.
But isn't there a specific meaning of transaction costs rather than all the on costs? I mean, all, like you say, all the projects are expensive.
But the transaction costs are what it costs to transact that scheme, and how far back upstream you take those costs.
But the cost of building in Washington DC.
No. Of course, yeah, that's
so the like-for-like comparison
yes,
is
okay.
really
yeah.
interesting, and direct payments to people. The transaction cost of that versus.
But you still have to incorporate, and there is still, there's other people that are very qualified economists very close to me in the room at the moment, and I'm not an economist, but it is still a question of how far back you take those, because all of those are part of the transaction. You can't have the guy on the ground. Yes, of course, but you can't have the guy on the ground doing the agreement if you don't have their senior person.
So, as the schemes become more conditional and require more additionality, the cost of monitoring that is a really important element. And of course, what's really unique about the things we've been talking about are exactly additionality and conditionality. So additionality has to be demonstrated against some kind of baseline, so that requires some measurement. And that measurement has to be verifiable independently. So in the context of Red Plus, there's a lot of sort of third-party verification going on. Van Vivo, Voluntary Carbon Standards, they're providing a service. so that someone who's actually transacting can confidently say that there is a net carbon gain from this scheme, because real money is exchanging hands in those cases, right? So, but that creates an infrastructure of monitoring, of verification, which is costly because of the technologies that are involved in doing that. So your simplest scheme, if it were unconditional and didn't care about additionality, could be implemented at very low cost. But in order for it to demonstrably provide the additional gains, you have to incur these additional costs. So you create a complex infrastructure, which is costly. And then you create an industry of middlemen who then have to kind of do the monitoring.
Just very briefly on that. I have been a trustee for the Blackview Foundation for 6 years and the chair over the past 2 years. And I have been involved with many projects that are selling carbon offsets. It's kind of the one ethical carbon offsetting standard that exists. And all of these projects, they have to be able, first is part of the standard that 60% of whatever money is sold as a carbon offset has to go back to the communities, as payments and as investments in the community, so 60%. So straight away there, the managing organization that has to see how they manage this on 40%. So what these groups are doing is trying to diversify the activities that they do. And this is a very important lesson that is being learned, diversification. You can't survive selling carbon offsets. You're not going to survive just selling water. So you have to begin adding up to your business model. So you operate these systems as a business, just like a farmer will enter into a deal if it's something good for them. The project manager also has to be thinking of this as a business model where they bring in different things. I'm sure you do research and you do other things as well. So it's linking up with universities that will come and do project research. Virgilio is doing that all the time in Bolsa Floresta. So you have to add and just find many different avenues of financing, which is what national programs will do. They will try to create different funds that will allow different streams of funding to fund an activity that will just result in different benefits, but you have to diversify.
Okay, I think we're running out of time actually, so I'm going to draw the discussion to a close. Paul Elliott, who is the Chief Economist here at ID, is going to make a couple of comments just to conclude with.
Yeah, okay. I was just going to try and bring together some of the strands of the discussion. I mean, we've had obviously a very wide-ranging discussion. I just wanted to highlight some of the key topics that have come up, and I wanted to pick up on three. The first one is payments, the second one is conditionality, and the third one is upscaling. So on payments, we heard from Julia about, are the payments enough for some of these very poor families in Madagascar? Are the payments being eaten up by the transaction costs we've heard about in Bolivia? Who should pay in the case of the Salt Lake City example? Should it be the beneficiaries or the polluters? And then interestingly, who decides who should pay, as in the case of Bolivia? So that itself is an issue around payments. Then secondly, on conditionality, we've had, combined with that topic, the issue of reciprocity and additionality and targeting, and in each of the different cases, how conditionality maybe needs to be unpacked to bring in these other concepts. And then finally, the topic we closed on now, upscaling. How do we move from these watershed by watershed schemes to something that adds up to something much larger, where we have, as Nigel was talking about, 20% of the country covered? Is it by bringing in a private sector sponsor, as he succeeded with Coca-Cola? Is it by going with these very big nationally funded schemes like has happened in China and India? So is it a combination of bottom-up or top-down? And that can try and address these transaction costs and address the upscaling challenge. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. So with that, we'll draw the evening to a close. So please thank the panel for their very interesting talks. And thank you very much to IIED for hosting us. And thank you all for coming and taking part in this event. And do look out for the publications on the ESPA website and the report of this event.